She woke up to the soft light slipping through the thin curtains. The city outside was quiet, with only the occasional hum of a distant car or the faint chatter of someone walking down the street. She stretched and sat up, rubbing the sleep from her eyes. The apartment was small but cozy, filled with the kind of scattered belongings that told the story of a life lived alone. Books stacked in uneven towers, mugs left on the counter, a chair that seemed to wait patiently for someone to sit in it. Her morning routine was simple, almost automatic, like a rhythm her body had learned over time. She got out of bed, made her way to the kitchen, and turned on the kettle. The smell of coffee filled the small space as she waited for it to brew, the steam curling into the air like a soft invitation to start the day. As she waited, her eyes drifted toward the table by the window. Something unusual caught her attention. A small envelope sat there, perfectly placed as if it had been waiting for her. She frowned, slightly confused. She hadn't ordered anything, hadn't asked for letters or packages. The envelope was simple, off-white with no markings, no return address, just a tiny flap sealed neatly. Curiosity nudged her forward. She picked it up, feeling the weight in her hand, and tore it open. Inside was a small, delicate key, old-fashioned with a brass sheen and tiny engravings that made it look like it belonged to another time. There was no note, no explanation, nothing to say where it had come from or why it was there. She turned it over in her hand, studying it from every angle. The metal was cold and smooth, heavy in a way that made it feel important. She couldn't remember ever seeing a key like this before. Her mind ran through possibilities. Maybe a neighbor had left it by mistake. Maybe it had fallen out of someone's bag during the night. Maybe it was a gift, though she couldn't imagine who would leave something like this for her. A strange feeling settled in her chest, a mix of curiosity and unease. She set it back on the table and looked at it again, as if the key itself might start to speak and explain why it had come into her life. She tried to push the thought aside and began her day. She dressed quickly, put on her coat, and stepped out into the crisp morning air. The streets were calm, the sunlight warm on her face. Everything seemed normal at first, the familiar rhythm of the city wrapping around her like an old, comfortable sweater. She walked past small shops opening for the day, a bakery with the smell of fresh bread spilling into the street, and a cafe where a few early risers sipped their drinks quietly. Yet despite the ordinary morning, the key on her table kept tugging at her mind, refusing to let her focus entirely on the routine. By the time she returned home in the afternoon, the key was still on the table and she found herself drawn to it again. She picked it up and turned it over, feeling the grooves under her fingers, noticing the tiny scratches that told the story of its use over time. Something about it was personal, like it had belonged to someone who had held it for years, someone who had trusted it to be carried, kept safe. She couldn't explain why, but it felt as if the key had been waiting for her specifically. She remembered the way it had looked, the way it had felt heavy yet comforting in her hand. She tried to put the key aside and go about her day. She cleaned a little, made dinner, watched a few episodes of a show she had been following, but each time she saw the key it called to her curiosity. She wanted to know what door it opened. She wanted to know who had left it. That night as she lay in bed, the key sat on her nightstand, catching the moonlight streaming through the window. Her thoughts wandered. Could it be a mistake? Could it be a prank? Or maybe someone had noticed her loneliness and wanted to reach out in a small, mysterious way. The possibilities swirled in her mind, keeping sleep at bay longer than usual. The next morning she made a decision. She would go out and try to see if the key had a purpose. She didn't know where to start, so she took a walk through the neighborhood, hoping some familiar sight would spark a memory or a clue. The city was waking up now, the streets busier with people going to work, children running to school, and shopkeepers opening their doors. She wandered slowly, letting her mind drift as her eyes scanned the buildings and alleyways. Then she noticed it, a building she had passed many times but never really seen. It was old, its bricks worn and covered in patches of ivy. The windows were dusty, some cracked, the kind of building that seemed forgotten by time. Something about it pulled at her, a sense of connection she couldn't explain. She remembered the key in her pocket, the smooth, cold metal pressing against her palm. Without thinking too much, she walked toward the building. She circled it, looking for a door or a lock. At the back, hidden partially by ivy and shadow, she found a small wooden door, weathered and slightly crooked. Her heart raced. She knelt down and held the key to the lock. It fit perfectly. She hesitated for a moment, breath catching in her throat, then turned it. The lock clicked open easily. The sound echoed faintly in the quiet of the afternoon, a small but powerful signal that something had changed. She pushed the door open slowly. Inside was a space that felt suspended in time. Dust motes floated in the light coming through a skylight, and there was a faint smell of old paper and wood polish. The room was small, intimate, and arranged as if someone had been living there quietly. A notebook lay open on a table, its pages filled with careful handwriting. A painting leaned against the wall, unfinished, the brushstrokes still wet in some areas. A teacup sat on the edge of a shelf, the faint steam rising as if it had been recently used. Every object felt deliberate, as if it had been left with care and intention. She stepped inside cautiously, her curiosity pushing her forward despite the rising tension in her chest. As she looked around, she realized this place had a story. It wasn't just a random space. Someone had been here, had lived here in secret, and had left it for her to find. The thought made her shiver. Who would do this and why? She sat down on a small stool and opened the notebook, reading the words carefully. They were fragments of a life she had never known, thoughts and sketches, pieces of conversations and reflections. It was personal, yet somehow welcoming, like the person had wanted someone to find them and understand. Hours passed as she explored. She touched the objects gently, afraid to disturb anything but unable to stop herself from examining the space. She felt a connection forming, invisible but strong, as if she had been drawn into the secret world for a reason. The key in her pocket had opened more than just a door. It had opened a new part of life she hadn't realized was waiting for her. She felt both excitement and fear, the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders. She didn't know the person who had left this space for her, but she understood one thing clearly. It was meant to change her life. As evening fell, she reluctantly closed the door behind her. She carried the key in her hand, the small metal weight grounding her. Back in her apartment, she placed it carefully on the table just as she had found it. She couldn't stop thinking about the room, the notebook, the objects that seemed to speak without words. Sleep came slowly that night, but for the first time in a long time, it was accompanied by a feeling of anticipation, of hope, and of curiosity that stretched beyond her ordinary life. She knew that this key was not an accident, and that her life, quiet and routine for so long, was about to take a turn she couldn't yet imagine. The next morning, the key still lay on the table. She picked it up again, feeling the smooth brass under her fingers. It was heavy in the right way, the kind of weight that reminded her that some things in life are meant to be discovered, not explained. She didn't know what awaited her next, or who had left the key, or what doors it would open, but she felt ready to follow wherever it led, trusting that something important, something meaningful was waiting just beyond the next turn. And for the first time in a long time, she felt the quiet thrill of possibility, the feeling that life could be more than just routine, that it could surprise her in ways she had never imagined. The next morning started like any other. She woke up to the faint sound of the city outside, cars passing, birds calling from the rooftops, and the distant clatter of someone opening their shop shutters. The world was moving as usual, yet something about that small brass key sitting on her table refused to let her morning feel ordinary. She made herself coffee and tried to ignore it, telling herself it was probably some delivery mix-up or a prank, but it didn't feel like a joke. The key was old, heavy, and clearly used before. Its edges were worn smooth, and the faint pattern carved into its head looked like it once belonged to something important. The small folded note beside it still lay unopened. She picked it up again, staring at the uneven handwriting that said only, "For you, for me." The words kept echoing in her mind. She didn't know why they made her chest tighten. Finally, she unfolded the paper. Inside, there was a short message written in neat but slightly faded ink. "When you find what this opens, you'll understand." That was all. No address, no name. Her fingers brushed over the letters as if they might reveal more if she touched them gently enough. She looked around her apartment, the same small space she'd lived in for years. The only locks she knew of were her door, her balcony latch, and a drawer she kept her old letters in. She tried them all one by one. The key didn't fit any. For a while, she stood there in the middle of her living room, holding it, feeling both foolish and strangely compelled. Who would go through the trouble of leaving something like this? And why her? She thought about calling her landlord, but what would she even say? Hi, someone left a key on my table. Do you know what it opens? It sounded absurd, so she slipped the key into her pocket and went about her day. But the thought of it followed her everywhere. While she rode the bus, while she worked at her desk, even while she ate lunch. Every time she felt its weight against her leg, something inside her stirred, as if a small invisible door had opened and refused to close again. By the time she got home that evening, she was restless. She set her bag down, took out the key, and studied it again. In the light from her window, she noticed something she hadn't before. A tiny number scratched into one side. 17B. Her heart skipped. That was the same number as the storage room in the basement of her building, a room that had been locked since she'd moved in. She'd always assumed it was for maintenance or equipment, but she had never seen anyone go in or out. Curiosity grew stronger than her hesitation. She slipped on her shoes, grabbed a small flashlight, and headed downstairs. The basement was cool and quiet, filled with the smell of concrete and dust. Rows of doors lined the corridor, most with small labels on them. 10A, 12C, 15D, and then there it was. 17B. The door was old metal with paint peeling around the edges. A heavy padlock hung on it, rusted but still firm. She knelt down, her heart pounding, and slowly slid the key into the lock. For a moment, it didn't move. Then, with a faint click, it turned. Her breath caught. She hesitated before pushing the door open, her hand trembling slightly. The hinges groaned, and a wave of cool air rushed out. Inside was darkness, thick and heavy, but the beam of her flashlight cut through it, revealing what lay beyond. It wasn't a storage room. Not exactly. The small space was lined with shelves and covered in old cloths and boxes, but in the center stood something unexpected. An old wooden table covered in papers, brushes, and small glass jars filled with dried paint. On the walls hung faded sketches and unfinished paintings, some half-rolled, others pinned loosely. It looked like an artist's studio, one frozen in time. She stepped inside slowly, shining the light across the walls. Dust floated in the beam like golden flecks. Every corner told a story. There were notes written in the margins of papers, small sketches of people, cityscapes, and keys, so many keys drawn in different shapes and sizes. On the table, a small notebook lay open. The first page had a single sentence written in familiar handwriting. If you are reading this, then you were meant to find it. She felt her throat tighten. It was the same hand that had written the note left with the key. She turned the page. The next lines were softer, written almost like a whisper. I used to paint light, the kind that people forget to notice. I left these pieces behind because I couldn't take them with me. But if you've come here, maybe you still believe that small things matter. Keep them alive. Her hands trembled as she read. She didn't know who this person was, and the artist, the stranger, but their voice reached her across time, as if they were sitting right beside her. She sat down at the table, brushing away the dust, and ran her fingers along the brushes and jars. The paints had dried, but the colors still clung faintly to the glass, like memories refusing to fade. She looked up at one of the canvases on the wall, a half-finished painting of a door standing in an empty field, light spilling through it. For a moment, she felt something stir inside her, a sense of recognition she couldn't explain. She stayed there for hours, reading through the rest of the notebook. Some pages spoke of loneliness, others of hope. One short entry caught her attention. If one day someone finds this place, don't fix what's broken. Just see it. It was such a simple request, yet it hit deep. By the time she finally left the basement, the city outside had grown dark. She locked the door again carefully and kept the key. As she climbed the stairs, she felt lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because she had discovered something beautiful. Heavier because she didn't know what to do with it. That night she couldn't sleep. She kept replaying everything in her head. The note, the studio, the paintings. Who had written those words? Why had they chosen her? When dawn came, she got up, poured herself a cup of coffee, and sat by the window with the key in her hand. The morning light crept across her table just like before, but this time it landed on the brass key and made it glow softly. And for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel lonely. She didn't fully understand what had happened, but deep down she sensed it wasn't random. It felt as though someone, or something, had handed her a quiet invitation to look at life differently. To notice again, to see the beauty hidden in forgotten corners. She reached for her sketchbook, something she hadn't touched in months, and began to draw the room she had found. The old door, the unfinished painting, the light spilling across the table. Her lines were uncertain at first, but soon her hands moved naturally, as though they remembered something her heart had always known. When she finally stopped, she looked at her drawing and smiled. The stranger's message had found its way into her, not through logic, but through feeling. It was only the beginning. She didn't know it yet, but that one unlocked door would lead her to discover not just someone else's lost world, but also parts of herself she had long forgotten. Because sometimes, a stranger's key doesn't just open a door, it opens you. The days that followed felt different. Every morning when she woke up, her first thought was of that hidden room. The images played in her mind over and over. The soft light through the skylight, the open notebook, the half-finished painting. It felt like stepping into someone's memory, someone's quiet world that she had accidentally inherited. She told herself she wouldn't go back right away. She didn't want to seem obsessed with a mystery she couldn't explain. But curiosity doesn't fade that easily. On the third day after work, she found herself walking down the same narrow street, her steps almost automatic. The sky was turning orange, the city wrapped in that gentle moment before nightfall. She reached the old building and stood there for a while, staring at it from across the street. It looked the same, quiet, forgotten, but to her it had changed completely. It was now a secret place, one that felt oddly personal. Finally, she crossed the street and walked to the hidden door. The ivy brushed against her coat as she reached for the key in her pocket. Her hand hesitated before turning the lock again. When the door opened, the familiar scent of old wood and paper filled the air. The light was dim, but the room still felt warm, welcoming, as if it had been waiting for her to return. She stepped inside and closed the door behind her. The notebook was still on the table, though now a small dried leaf had fallen onto it, carried in through a crack in the window. She sat down and opened the pages again. The handwriting was delicate, looping across the yellowed paper. It wasn't written like a diary. It was more like letters. Messages written to no one in particular, or perhaps to whoever might find them one day. She began to read. The words spoke of small things. The sound of rain against the roof, the smell of paint, the way the city changes color during sunset. But there were also deeper thoughts, reflections about time, loss, and the quiet meaning in everyday moments. As she read, she felt a strange connection growing stronger, as though the writer somehow understood her life, her solitude, her quiet longing for something more. She spent hours there, reading page after page. By the time she looked up, the light from the skylight had faded completely, replaced by the silver glow of the moon. She realized it was late and hurried home, locking the door behind her. But that night she couldn't sleep. Her mind was filled with questions. Who was the person who had written all that? Why had they chosen her, if they really had, to find the key? The next morning she decided to search for clues outside the room. She began asking subtle questions in the neighborhood. There was a small bakery nearby, and she casually asked the woman behind the counter if she knew anything about the old building down the street. The baker nodded thoughtfully. That place? It's been empty for a while. Used to belong to an old artist, she said. He kept mostly to himself, kind man. Always painting or sketching in that room of his. Haven't seen him in months. Something inside her tightened. So there had been someone, a real person who had lived and worked in that space. The baker mentioned that the man had passed away quietly a few months ago, with no family left. Most of his belongings were cleared out, but the building itself remained. No one had the heart to sell it. She thanked the woman and left, her mind spinning. The story matched the feeling she had when she first entered that hidden room. It wasn't just a forgotten place, it was someone's life, left behind like an unfinished chapter. Back at her apartment, she placed the key on the table again and stared at it. A feeling of guilt began to rise in her chest. What right did she have to enter that space? To touch those things, to read those words that might have been private? Maybe the key wasn't meant for her at all. Maybe she had misread everything. But another thought pushed through the guilt. What if the key had been left for someone to find on purpose? What if it was a final invitation to keep a piece of that person's world alive? That night, as she tried to fall asleep, she kept hearing small noises outside her window. The creak of footsteps, the faint rustle of leaves. It made her uneasy. Maybe it was nothing, just the sounds of the city at night, but she couldn't shake the feeling that someone might be watching her, or that the secret she had stumbled into wasn't as private as she'd thought. The next day, she went back again, this time carrying a small bag. She brought a notebook of her own, a pen and a thermos of tea. The moment she stepped inside the old room, the silence welcomed her again. She sat at the same table and opened her notebook beside the old one. Then, almost without realizing it, she began to write. Not answers, but reflections. She wrote about how she found the key, about the confusion and wonder of stepping into a stranger's world. Writing felt right, like she was continuing a conversation that had started long before she arrived. As the hours passed, she noticed small details she hadn't seen before. A photograph half hidden behind a canvas showing the same room but brighter, filled with sunlight and brushes. A faint signature on one of the paintings. And on the wall near the corner, she found something carved into the wood, a simple phrase, "For the one who needs to find it." Her breath caught. Those words made everything clearer. The key, the notebook, the open room, they weren't accidents. The artist had known someone would come someday. Maybe he didn't know who, but he believed that the right person would find their way there when they needed it most. She felt tears sting her eyes. For so long, her life had been quiet and predictable, filled with routines that left her numb. But now, for the first time in years, she felt connected, to a stranger, to a story, to something bigger than herself. Still, the feeling of being watched lingered. Each time she left the building, she felt eyes on her back, though when she turned, there was never anyone there. It could have been her imagination, or maybe others knew about the place and wanted it for themselves. The uncertainty gnawed at her, but her curiosity was stronger. A week later, she returned again, this time to find something different. The notebook she had been reading was gone. Panic rushed through her. She searched every corner, checked behind canvases, under tables, inside drawers, but it wasn't there. Only her own notebook remained untouched. She sat on the stool, her hands trembling. Who else had been there? She remembered the noises outside her window, the faint creaks in the hallways. Maybe she wasn't the only one who had a key. Maybe the artist had left more than one, trusting that whoever found them would protect his space. Or maybe someone else had been watching all along, waiting for her to open the door first. That night she couldn't eat. The city felt colder, the streets sharper, every shadow carrying a question she couldn't answer. She thought about the missing notebook, the carved words, the artist's quiet life. Part of her wanted to walk away, to lock the door and forget everything. But she couldn't. Something about it felt unfinished, like there was still a message she hadn't yet understood. The next morning she returned once more, though she almost turned back halfway. When she opened the door, a wave of relief and surprise hit her. The notebook was back on the table. But there was something new inside it. Someone had written a message on the last page in the same delicate handwriting. "If you are reading this, it means you found it. Don't stop now." Her hands shook as she read those words. She didn't know whether to feel afraid or grateful. But one thing was certain, the story wasn't over. She had been chosen to find that key for a reason. And whatever the reason was, she was now part of something she couldn't walk away from. She closed the notebook slowly, the pages rustling softly in the quiet air. The room felt alive again, like it was breathing with her. She placed her hand over the old book, whispering softly to no one, "I won't stop." The promise hung in the air, quiet but certain. She didn't know what truth waited ahead, but she knew she had to find it. The days after that felt heavier, as if the air around her carried a quiet message she couldn't quite understand. Every time she held the key, it reminded her of that note, those few words written on the last page. "Don't stop now." They felt like both a warning and a guide. She didn't know who had written them or when, but she knew she couldn't ignore them anymore. She returned to the hidden room more often now. Each visit felt different. The first time had been filled with curiosity, the second with wonder, the third with unease. But now she entered with purpose. She began studying everything carefully, the paintings, the scattered sketches, even the dust-covered shelves. She wasn't just exploring anymore. She was searching for meaning. The air inside the room was thick with time. Every inch of it seemed to hold a story. She could almost feel the presence of the person who had once called this place home. their thoughts, their solitude, their quiet patience. She noticed something she hadn't before. Behind one of the canvases, leaned against the wall, there was another door, smaller, almost hidden in the shadows. Its paint had peeled away and its lock was rusted, but it looked just the right size for the same brass key she carried. Her heart began to race. Could there really be more behind this? She took a deep breath and stepped closer. The lock looked old, stubborn, but she slid the key in anyway. It fit perfectly again, as if it had been waiting all this time for her hand. She turned it gently. The door creaked open. Inside was a narrow hallway leading to a smaller room, one that smelled faintly of paint and cedar. There were more paintings here, but unlike the others, these were covered with cloths. She pulled one away carefully. The painting underneath showed a familiar street, the one she walked every morning on her way to work. Another painting showed the very cafe she often sat in on rainy days. And another, even more startling, showed her apartment building. She stepped back, her mind spinning. How could this be possible? She didn't know the artist personally, hadn't even known of his existence until recently, and yet these paintings looked as if they had been inspired by her life. There was even one painting that showed a small table by a window, with an envelope and a brass key placed neatly on top. A chill ran through her. It was the exact scene from the day she first found the key. The artist had somehow painted that moment long before it happened. She sat down, trying to steady her breathing. Her hands trembled slightly as she reached for the last painting in the corner. This one was unfinished, only half-colored, but she could tell what it was. It was a portrait of her, not a perfect likeness, but close enough to be unmistakable. Her hair, her posture, the thoughtful look in her eyes. It was her. She stared at it for a long time, unable to speak. The air in the room felt charged now, alive with questions she couldn't answer. She turned to the table where the notebook still lay. She opened it again, flipping through the pages until she reached the end. Below the last message there was a faint outline of another note that had been written in pencil, barely visible under the light. She held the book closer and read the words, "We don't always meet people in time, but sometimes time finds a way to connect us anyway." Her breath caught. The words sank deep, stirring something inside her she hadn't felt in years, a strange mix of sadness, awe, and warmth. It was as if the artist had known her, even before they ever crossed paths. She began to piece it together slowly. The artist had painted places and people from the neighborhood, observing quietly, finding stories in ordinary lives. Maybe he had seen her once, sitting by the cafe window, lost in thought. Maybe he had noticed her walking home in the rain or passing by this old building every evening. And maybe in his quiet way he had chosen her, not for who she was, but because she represented the quiet humanity he saw in everyone. That night, she couldn't sleep again. The world outside her window seemed different, familiar but charged with new meaning. Every building, every light, every sound felt like part of a larger story. She kept the notebook close beside her, flipping through the pages again and again. The next morning, she returned to the building one last time. The air was cooler now, the faint smell of autumn in the wind. Inside, the room felt peaceful. She placed her hand on the unfinished painting, the one that looked like her, and smiled softly. It was strange how a single object, a small brass key, could open not just a door but a world of connection between two people who had never truly met. She spent hours cleaning the room that day. She wiped the dust off the shelves, folded the cloths neatly, and arranged the notebooks in a small stack. She wanted to honor the space, to keep it alive. It didn't feel right to let it fade into silence again. As she worked, she found another envelope tucked behind the drawer of the old desk. Inside was a letter, yellowed with age but still readable. It was written in the same looping handwriting as the notebook. "If someone ever finds this place, know that it is yours for as long as you need it. It was my home, my refuge, and my way of keeping the world close. The key is not meant to open just a door. It's meant to open something inside you. Whoever you are, take what you find here and make it your own. Leave it better than you found it. And when the time comes, leave the key for someone else." Her eyes filled with tears as she finished reading. The message felt deeply personal, as if the artist had known what she needed to hear. She folded the letter carefully and placed it back in the envelope. That was the revelation she hadn't known she was waiting for. The mystery wasn't about a secret or a hidden treasure. It was about connection, about one person reaching across time to remind another that life could still be full of meaning, even in silence. even in loneliness. The key was never about ownership. It was about continuation. She stayed in the room until the sunlight faded. Then she stood by the small door and looked around one last time. Everything felt calm now. The unease she had once felt was gone, replaced by quiet gratitude. She realized that the artist had left her not a puzzle, but a purpose, to keep something beautiful alive. As she stepped outside, she noticed the evening sky painted in soft shades of pink and gold. She held the key tightly in her hand, feeling its warmth. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel alone. That night, she sat by her window, the key resting beside her cup of tea. The city lights blinked in the distance, and she thought of the stranger who had somehow changed her life, without ever speaking a single word to her. She smiled, realizing that some connections don't need to be seen or explained. They simply happen when hearts are open enough to notice. The next morning, she woke up early, filled with calm energy. She took a blank canvas, her paints, and the notebook from the hidden room. Then she began to paint. Her first brushstrokes were uncertain, but soon they grew steadier, freer. She painted the room, the light through the skylight, the hidden door, and finally the key that had started it all. As the picture took shape, she felt something shift inside her. It was as if she had found her voice, not through words, but through the quiet act of creating. When the painting was done, she looked at it for a long time. Then she smiled and whispered softly to herself, "Thank you." The morning light slid quietly across her floor, touching the corner of the canvas she had finished the night before. For a moment, she simply stood there, holding her cup of tea, looking at what she had made. The painting felt alive. It was more than color and lines. It was everything she had lived through since the day that small brass key appeared on her table. The apartment was still, but her heart wasn't heavy anymore. The silence didn't feel empty. It felt full. She had begun to fill it herself with thought, with art, with purpose. A week passed like that, slow and gentle. She worked during the day, painted in the evenings, and sometimes went back to the hidden room just to sit there. She didn't search for more clues or try to understand what couldn't be explained. She simply listened to the soft hum of the air, to the stories that space carried. One afternoon, she brought flowers. She placed them on the old wooden table beside the notebook, where the artist's words still rested. Then she opened her own notebook and wrote a short letter, not to anyone in particular, just to whoever might find it someday. She wrote about how she had found the key by accident and how it had changed everything. She wrote about how a stranger's kindness, even one expressed in silence, could reach across time. She wrote about how everyone leaves traces of themselves in the world, small acts, forgotten gestures, that might one day become a gift for someone else. When she finished, she folded the paper and slid it between the last pages of the old notebook. It felt right to leave her voice beside his. The building was quiet that day, the air warm with dust and late sunlight. She stood for a while by the small door, looking around one last time. Every painting, every brush, every page seemed to belong exactly where it was. She whispered softly, "Thank you," the same words she had said in her apartment. It felt like closing a circle. She locked the door behind her and stepped out into the cool afternoon. The street looked the same as always. Children playing, a bicycle leaning against a fence, the smell of bread drifting from the bakery. But for her, everything had more color now. She noticed things she had never paid attention to before, the way light pooled in puddles after rain, the sound of laughter echoing between walls, the kindness in small everyday exchanges. She carried the key in her pocket for several days after that. It had become part of her, a quiet reminder of what she had learned. But as days turned into weeks, she realized it didn't truly belong to her anymore. The artist's letter had said it clearly, leave the key for someone else, so she thought carefully about how to do it. She didn't want to force the mystery onto anyone. She wanted it to happen naturally, the same way it had found her. One morning she took a long walk through the neighborhood, letting instinct guide her steps. The city was waking slowly, the sky soft and blue. She passed by the cafe where she often sat and stopped for a moment, smiling at the window where she used to watch people hurry by. Then she kept walking until she reached the park near the river. There was a wooden bench beneath an old tree, half hidden from view. It felt like the right place. She sat there quietly for a while, listening to the water and the birds. Then she took the key out of her pocket. The brass glinted softly in the light. She ran her fingers over it, remembering everything it had led her to. The secret room, the paintings, the note that said, "Don't stop now," and the feeling of connection that had changed her life. She placed the key gently on the bench beside her, wrapped in a small envelope just like the one she had found. Inside, she added a short note. "This key once opened a door. Maybe it will open something for you too." Then she stood up and walked away without looking back. As she crossed the bridge toward home, a sense of calm washed over her. It wasn't sadness, it was peace. She felt as though she had passed along a tiny spark, the same one she had received when she least expected it. Somewhere, someday, someone else would find that envelope and their own story would begin. That evening, she returned to her apartment and opened the windows wide. The air was cool and smelled of rain. She sat by the table, the same one where it had all started, and looked at the empty spot where the envelope had once rested. Strangely, it didn't feel empty anymore. She had learned that meaning doesn't come from having things. It comes from what we choose to give away. She picked up her paintbrush again. Her next painting wasn't of rooms or doors. It was of light, soft light breaking through clouds, spilling over rooftops, touching everything in its path. As she painted, she thought about the artist and the way he had seen beauty in small, quiet things. She understood him now. Art wasn't just about creating something beautiful. It was about keeping hope alive, about leaving a piece of yourself for others to find. Weeks passed. Her life settled into a new rhythm, but it wasn't the same kind of routine as before. She spoke to her neighbors more, smiled at strangers, and found joy in the little exchanges that once went unnoticed. People began to know her as the woman who always carried a sketchbook and who sometimes gave away small drawings to children or to anyone who looked like they needed a moment of kindness. One afternoon, as she sat in the cafe sketching quietly, a young man approached her table. In his hand, he held a small envelope. "Excuse me," he said shyly, "did you drop this?" "I found it on a bench near the river." Her heart skipped. She smiled, shaking her head. "No," she said softly. "But maybe it's meant for you." He looked puzzled, then curious. He sat down and opened the envelope right there. Inside was the brass key and the note she had written. She watched his expression change from confusion to quiet wonder. He turned the key over in his hand the way she once had and looked at her. "Do you know what it opens?" he asked. She smiled again, her eyes gentle. "Not exactly," she said, "but it might open something important." He laughed softly, uncertain but intrigued, and thanked her. When he left, she watched him walk away down the street, the envelope tucked safely into his jacket pocket. For a moment, she saw herself from months ago, curious, lost, standing at the start of something unknown. She turned back to her sketchbook and began to draw the scene. The young man walking into the distance, the faint glow of sunlight on the river, and the key in his hand. As she drew, she felt the quiet satisfaction of knowing the story would continue, though she might never see where it led. That was the beauty of it. Some stories don't need endings. They just keep unfolding, passed from one heart to another. That night, she sat by her window again, looking out over the city lights. Somewhere out there, another person now held the same key that had once changed her life. Maybe they would find the hidden room. Maybe they would discover their own secret message. Or maybe the key would lead them somewhere entirely new. Either way, she knew the purpose had been fulfilled. What had started as a mystery had become a quiet chain of kindness, linking strangers through simple faith that the world could still surprise us. Before she went to bed, she looked once more at her painting of light. She whispered, as though speaking to the artist who had started it all, "I understand now. You wanted the story to keep going." Outside, the wind rustled softly through the trees. Somewhere a door creaked open, and though she couldn't see it, she liked to imagine another person standing in front of a hidden room, key in hand, about to discover that life sometimes leaves us gifts we don't expect, gifts that open more than doors. Months had passed since she last saw the young man in the cafe. Life had quietly returned to its steady rhythm, yet a small part of her always wondered what had happened after that. Did he find something behind a door the way she once did? Or did the key open something entirely different, perhaps a new chapter in his own heart? She didn't try to find out. Some stories, she realized, were meant to remain partly untold. The mystery gave them breath, kept them alive in the imagination. Still, there were moments when memories returned, like small echoes of the past tapping gently on her shoulder. Sometimes it happened when she passed a bookstore window and saw an old journal on display, or when sunlight landed on her table in the exact same angle as the day she found the envelope. Each time a warm calmness settled over her. The experience no longer felt like a question waiting to be answered. It felt like a quiet truth she carried with her. Her art began to change. People noticed it before she did. Her paintings had once been careful and structured, the kind that tried to capture how things looked. But now they captured how things felt. Each canvas seemed to hold a secret, a glow that drew people in. She didn't plan it that way. She just painted from memory, from emotion, from the strange mix of wonder and peace the key had left behind. One day, an art gallery reached out after seeing her work online. They wanted to display her series, the ones inspired by light, time, and unseen connections. She was nervous but said yes. The night of the exhibition, she stood quietly near the entrance, dressed simply, her hands clasped. The room buzzed with soft music and low conversation. People moved slowly from one painting to another, pausing often, whispering their thoughts. A woman stopped in front of one piece, a painting of an open door with sunlight spilling through. She stood there for a long time, her eyes glistening. Then she turned to the painter and said softly, "This feels like hope." Those words stayed with her all evening. Hope, that was it. That was what she had been painting all along. As the night went on, she met others who shared stories of how her art reminded them of moments in their own lives. A letter they'd once found, a stranger who helped them, a place that still felt alive even after time had moved on. Listening to them, she realized that what had happened to her was no longer just her story. It had become something bigger, something that belonged to anyone who believed that even small mysteries can hold meaning. Later that night, after the gallery lights dimmed and the guests had gone, she stayed behind for a moment. The space was quiet again, filled only with the faint echo of footsteps and music. She walked slowly to the painting of the door. It was her favorite. She reached out and touched the frame lightly, almost like greeting an old friend. Then she noticed something unexpected. On the little table by the corner, where people had left their comments and notes about the exhibit, there was a small envelope. No name, no message on the front. Her breath caught. She hesitated, heart pounding in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. She picked it up. The paper felt familiar under her fingers, almost identical to the one that had once appeared on her own table. She opened it carefully. Inside was not a key this time, but a folded piece of parchment. There were only 4 words written in neat handwriting. "You passed it on." She stared at the note for a long time, her eyes wide, then slowly filled with tears. A quiet laugh escaped her lips, half disbelief, half gratitude. She didn't know who had left it. It could have been the young man. It could have been someone else entirely. Maybe the key had found another hand, another story. Or maybe the message was symbolic, a simple reminder from the universe itself. Whatever it was, it meant everything. She pressed the paper to her chest and whispered a soft thank you. Not to anyone in particular, but to the unseen thread that had connected so many hearts. From that night onward, her life didn't suddenly transform into something grand or dramatic. It became something gentler, more deeply lived. She continued painting, teaching art to children, and sometimes sharing the story of the key in small ways, never revealing all the details, only enough to spark curiosity and warmth. People would often ask, "Do you really think something like that could happen again?" And she would smile. "It already is," she'd say. Every time someone decides to do something kind without expecting anything back, that's the same magic. Years later, she found herself walking along the same riverside where she had left the key. The city had changed a little. New buildings, different faces, but the old bench was still there, standing quietly beneath the tree. She sat down for a moment, letting the sound of water fill her thoughts. The afternoon sun shimmered across the surface, turning everything golden. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply. When she opened them again, she noticed something on the far end of the bench. Another small envelope. She blinked, heart fluttering with both surprise and joy. She reached for it slowly, almost afraid it might disappear if she moved too fast. This one wasn't sealed. Inside was a tiny silver pendant shaped like a door, and a small note that said, "Every door leads somewhere. Keep opening them." She smiled, caught a wide, quiet smile that came from somewhere deep inside. She looked around but saw no one watching. Still, she whispered again, "Thank you." The pendant wasn't valuable, but it was perfect. She hung it on a thin chain and wore it every day after that, not as a charm but as a reminder. A reminder that the world often speaks softly, through coincidences, through people we barely meet, through moments that seem small but mean everything. As time moved forward, her story continued to travel. Someone wrote an article about the mysterious artist who paints light. A journalist interviewed her about the inspiration behind her work. She didn't talk about the key directly, but spoke about how one unexpected act from a stranger can change a life. People listening would nod, smile, and later write her letters about their own moments of quiet magic. And that was how it spread. Not through fame or noise, but through connection. Sometimes when she received those letters, she imagined each one as a key, invisible, opening doors inside people's hearts. Each message felt like proof that what had started with a single forgotten envelope had become something timeless. One evening, as she prepared for another small exhibition, she placed a simple wooden box near the entrance with a handwritten sign. "If you have a story of kindness or mystery, leave it here." By the end of the night, the box was full. Some letters told of strangers who helped carry groceries, others of old books that contained photos or pressed flowers from people unknown. A few spoke of real keys, found and lost again, always leading to something unexpected. She read every one of them, her eyes often filling with tears. And when she looked up from the last letter, she realized what the entire journey had been about. It wasn't about the key or the door or even the mystery behind them. It was about the chain, the invisible thread that runs through all acts of kindness, linking people who may never meet but still touch each other's lives. That night, before sleeping, she placed the silver pendant on her table beside the note that had once read, "You passed it on," she whispered, "and I'll keep doing so." Then she turned off the light. Outside, the moon hung quietly above the rooftops, shining like a keyhole in the sky. Somewhere in another part of the city, perhaps another story was beginning. One small act, one found object, one stranger at a time. Because once something opens your heart, it never really closes again.